I'm delighted to be with you this morning. First of all, I'm delighted because I've been working with the Adult Learning Consortium for several years, and I know how exciting it is, and particularly exciting for us outside of the state of Georgia to see the growth and the involvement and the commitment that you have to adult learners and helping adult learners go back to school. I'm also delighted to be here because it was in the 40s in Chicago on Saturday evening, and I love this weather, so thank you. This session is going to be talking about the Adult Learning Focused Institution, otherwise known as ALC, and that's why on your program the first letters are underlined. So when I talk about ALC for short, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I hope you will also be talking about ALC. To make that easier when you talk, and there'll be opportunities to, I hope, even if they're not formal opportunities, you'll contribute whenever the mood strikes you. But please don't just shout it out. Wait until Eric Jackson comes to you with a microphone because this is being recorded for posterity, I hope. And also to make it easier, you might want to move forward, but that's not necessary. You don't have to feel as though you're in a classroom. I know that there are some of you in this room who are new to the consortium, new to ALC, don't know anything about it. There are also others of you in the room who have been doing this for a while, who were in the first group of institutions that administered ALC. I'm going to try to talk to all of you. So for some of you, this may be elementary. I hope those are only a few slides. And for some of you, it may be beyond what you currently understand about ALC. I hope that's also only a few slides. I was in the session that Catherine Marino did immediately prior to this one, and some of you were also. Catherine talked about Donald Pratt and 5 elements of teaching. And so that struck home because what I'm going to be doing is focusing on some of those elements. Transmission, which is talking about the content. The other is apprentice kind of teaching, where I'm going to try and help you look at ways of working with the data, and then also developmental, which here talks about higher order skills. I hope that that doesn't exhibit too much hubris to talk about higher order skills, but I'm going to try, I hope, to help all of you get from the report that comes to you both in a book and also electronically to what do we do with this? How do we work with the data that's either on our computer or on our shelves? How do we get the report off our shelves and into practice so that it makes a difference and helps us succeed with recruiting, retaining, and finally graduating adult learners? CALE, as I said, is the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. And we are a nonprofit organization with our headquarters in Chicago. We're a membership organization. The University System of Georgia is a system member, and we're delighted about that. And in fact, many people from the University System of Georgia have participated in some CALE activities. For example, they've done presentations at our conference, and just this past spring, they did a webinar for us, which was a terrific webinar, and talked about how to get a consortium to work, how to get various institutions to work together to accomplish a goal. CALE's mission is to expand lifelong opportunities for adults. We've been doing that since the mid-1970s, when CALE started as a project of the Educational Testing Service. And it was a project to see whether prior learning assessment was possible. If adults were returning to school, could the learning that had taken place outside the college classroom be assessed validly with validity and also reliably with reliability? And what we found was yes. So that ever since the mid-1970s, so we're talking about a long time, CALE has been working with adult learners and focusing on the value of prior learning assessment. We also work with a variety of organizations in addition to educational institutions. And so we work with employers, labor organizations, and government. And through the years, we focused on one or the other of those organizations. And right now, our major focus is prior learning assessment and ALC. We have a new project called learningcounts.org, which is an online program to help adults earn prior learning credit. And you can find out all about it just by typing in learningcounts.org and seeing what turns up. We're very pleased with that. It's an initiative that is funded in its pilot phase by Lumina, by the Joyce Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, the Walmart Foundation, and the State Street Foundation. And the Adult Learning Consortium is one of our pilot institutions taken as a whole. So you might find out what's going on there if you are curious. We're all focusing on adult learners, everybody in this room, plus a lot of other people in the country, other states besides Georgia, institutions individually, both public and private, and also our president has spoken a lot about engaging adult learners and helping adult learners go back to school. One of the reasons that it is so important to engage adult learners is the economic reason that we cannot meet our workforce needs if we rely on the pipeline of 18 to 22-year-olds who typically are traditional college students. Indeed, we cannot close the gap that will be there in 32 states. And by being there, I mean by 2025 to have 50% of our adults with a college degree. And if you, I don't know if you can see this, but down toward the bottom you might see a little red smudge which says Georgia. It's over here. The state with the largest gap by 2025, even if they perform as the best states do in graduating high school seniors who go on to college and who are part of the traditional pipeline. The state with the largest gap will be Texas. They will have about 1.3 million vacancies for filling their jobs. Georgia does much better. Georgia has over 25,000, but that's still a lot. It's still a big gap. And Georgia is one of the 32 states that cannot meet the challenge unless they engage adult learners. And adult learners are the ones who will be able to meet the needs of the state. Cale looked at this and looked at the need to engage adult learners and found that there are very specific steps that colleges can take that will help improve access that adult learners have to college education, recruitment, retention, and finally success. And success understood as completing the credential. ALC began in the late 1990s. Cale said it's clear that there are some institutions that are doing well in attracting and retaining adult learners. What is it that they're doing? And so they looked at what those institutions were doing. They identified 8 principles of effectiveness for serving adult learners, and then they developed assessment tools. We developed the assessment tools with Noel Levitt, one of the sponsors of this session, in addition to Cale, and also with the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, NCHEM. Here are the principles that we identified when we looked at what institutions were doing successfully. And these are the principles of effectiveness. There are 9 of them. If you were paying attention a little earlier, I said there were 8 that were identified in the late 1990s. That's because in 2004 to 2007, we were funded by Lumina to look only at 2-year institutions, to look at community colleges. we looked at 26 programs in 25 community colleges, and what we found is that there was a ninth principle, which is transitions. And so we added transitions to the principles of effectiveness. We found that this was important not only for two-year institutions, which were the focus at that time, but also for four-year institutions. All of these principles are on our website. If you go to www.cale.org and click on to higher education, and then click on to adult learning focused institutions, you'll find a lot of information about ALC. And all of the principles are listed there. The first is outreach. What does the institution do to let people know about it? How does it communicate both electronically and in print? And how does it help learners overcome barriers in time, place, and tradition? I want to tell you an anecdote that you might find somewhat relevant. I was talking to people at an institution at a large state university that is a member of SREB, so you know the geographic region of the country. And in this group, they were saying that they had really done something terrific to reach out to adult learners. At that institution, you had to pay your bursar bill in person. And they realized that this was difficult for adults who were working. So they set up satellite bursar's office on the campus. They made sure that these offices were located close to the perimeter of the campus, that there was parking close by, that an adult could come, park, pay, and leave. It all got done very quickly. And then somebody in the group said, well, when is this office open? And they said, well, like all the other bursars and registrar's offices, it's open from 8 to 4. Well, if I had to pay a bill from 8 to 4, I couldn't do it. You know, and probably a lot of you couldn't, and I'm sure you know adults who couldn't do it. It had never occurred to the people that this would be a problem. When they realized it, because their consciousness was raised, they changed the hours. But that's the kind of outreach that sometimes institutions don't even think of. And then, of course, when we talk about distance learning, that's another kind of outreach. But looking at various ways to help adults earn their credentials. When we talk about overcoming barriers in time, place, and tradition, I also want to tell you that Kentucky did a study. Kentucky has an initiative, the Double the Numbers campaign, and it's a Kentucky Adult Learner Initiative. They did a telephone survey of adults and found out what 3 incentives adults would need to go back to school. Those incentives are financial aid, the opportunity to earn credit for prior learning, and flexible academic programming. So one way, certainly, that Kentucky has found empirically, Cale found empirically, is outreach, is how to offer the various opportunities to adults in flexible programs. Life and career planning is another important aspect for getting adults to come to your institution and to stay at the institution. When Noel Levitz has done surveys of the kinds of responses students give to their satisfaction with the important goal of life and career planning, they find this ranks lowest. That at most institutions, students are not happy with the life and career planning they have been given. Another anecdote, my Noel Levitz counterpart is Julie Bryant. She and I often give presentations together, and at one presentation she said that her husband, who has a college degree, decided that he wanted to change careers, and so he enrolled in a local community college. They live in the Midwest, so SREB states are in the clear for this one. But they live in the Midwest. He went to the community college. He enrolled in a class. He came back home. She said, how is this going to help you accomplish your career goals? He said, I have no idea. They told me I had to enroll in this class, so I'm enrolling. And she bet that he would not stay in that program because he really didn't see the relationship between his life and career plans and the courses that he needed to take. Financing is another important consideration. What kind of flexible options are there for payment? Many adults, for example, have tuition assistance provided by their employers. But typically the employer will provide that tuition assistance only after the student successfully completes the course. how does the student pay for the course up front, since most institutions will not say, oh, it's fine, enroll, you can pay for this later. So are there flexible payment options? The next is the assessment of learning outcomes. A, is it rigorous? And students do not want a degree or a credential that's handed to them without rigor. They do want assessment that does evaluate whether they have learned what they're supposed to learn. And also, does assessment include assessing learning from prior experiences? The learning from the prior experiences is what we're talking about. Can this be assessed by the institution? Just to talk about this a little bit, I want to talk about PLA. In your notebook, you have a copy of Fueling the Race. And there is an executive summary. You got the full report, which is great. This is a study that Cale did. We published it in the spring of 2010. We looked at adult learners in 48 institutions, public, private, 2-year, 4-year, for-profit, not-for-profit. We looked at over 62,000 student records. And what we looked at was prior learning assessment. Have students earned credit through prior learning assessment? And if so, how do these students compare to students who have not earned such credit in certain learning outcomes? About a quarter of the students had earned prior learning assessment credit. We looked at the years 2001 to 2008. Anybody have any idea why? Okay. I'll bet you really do know, but you're just too embarrassed to raise your hand or say something, or you didn't want to wait until Eric comes to the microphone for you to say something. But the reason is we collected the data in 2009. We wanted to be sure that students had a chance to finish. We know that adults don't take classes full time. And so we looked at students who had perhaps entered in 2001 and who would then have had more than 4 years to complete their degree. What we found is that regardless of the size of the school, the control of the school, the student's academic grade point average, the ethnicity of the student, the age of the student, whether the student got financial aid or not, students who had earned credit through prior learning graduated at a much higher rate than students who did not. And you can get all the graphs in here. You'll see it is significant. It will blow you away. That, now that your curiosity is there, okay, if you look at page 34, you will see that the dark blue part of the bar graph are students who did not earn PLA credit and did not graduate, 78%. Of those who earned PLA credit and did not graduate, 44%. So that means that 21% of students who did not earn PLA credit did graduate, whereas 56% of students who did earn PLA credit graduated. It's a pretty big difference. We also found that students take more courses. They persist if they have PLA credit. One of the things that often happens when we talk to institutions about PLA credit is that the institution says, why should we do this? Students pay less for the credit that they earn typically through prior learning assessment. They also are not going to be taking our course. We lose tuition. And if they earn credit for PLA, they're not going to take as many courses with us. That's a myth. Our studies show that's not true. The students who do earn PLA credit do take more courses at the institution. And so in the long run, the institution is the beneficiary of PLA credit, as well as the student and society at large having more graduates. We also found that there was a shorter time to degree. For bachelor's degree students, this varied, but it was certainly shorter. And for an adult student, that's important. Okay, that was just a little sideline for assessment. Principle number 4. Principle number 5 is the teaching learning process, multiple methods of teaching students. Suffolk County Community College did an ALC assessment. And what was found in the ALC assessment was that students and faculty and staff and administrators agreed they did a really good job in teaching and learning, the teaching and learning process. And I was making the presentation and I said, well, usually we say that if students and faculty, staff and administrators agree, that's a great marketing point. And so we encourage institutions to market the principle and that they're doing a good job. But I don't understand what you're going to do with teaching and learning process. And they jumped all over me. They said, absolutely not, you're wrong. Adults really care about teaching and learning. And are they considered adults? And are their opinions valued? And does the faculty member employ methods other than lecture? So for us, that really is a strong marketing point, and we think it's important for adult learners. So I don't say that anymore. Instead, I say this is really important, and if it is a point on which everybody agrees, then it is a good marketing tool. Student support systems, not just the academic experience, but what else happens to the students at the institution. You know, we talk about a concierge, we talk about a navigator. Is there a support system throughout the student's experience at the institution? Technology, not only does the technology relate to what the student needs to know, but does the student have access to the technology? And more than that, is the student taught how to use the technology? Many adults going back are a little bit uncomfortable with technology, or if they're comfortable with one kind of technology, they may not have had an introduction to the kind that's being used at the institution. So it's not simply having coursework and other information available by technology, but does the student know how to deal with it? Principle 8, strategic partnerships. This is something that the institution focuses on. Does it have partnerships with external groups? For example, employers in the community, employers who can offer internships related to life and career planning, employers who can talk about what happens at their institution. I was talking to somebody in an earlier session who said that many of the students in her classes do not have the soft skills you need to succeed in the world of work. They don't come to class on time. They text during class. They leave early. What kinds of information can local employers give to students about the soft skills? Also with regard to financial assistance, perhaps it's possible to get employers to sponsor named scholarships, particularly for less than full-time students. You know that federal aid is limited to students who take more than half-time classwork. Many states have limits too, but perhaps if local employers could offer a named scholarship for one course, they would help a lot more students for the same amount of money as 4 courses, and they would provide the aid to the students so that it would be win-win. Finally, transitions. Does the institution help the student move from what they were doing before and move towards something else? For example, does the institution have if it's a 2-year institution, does it have articulation agreements with 4-year institutions? Can it help the student know how the coursework would apply? Can it help the student take what the student has done before and use it in productive ways in the classroom? All of these principles are integrated, they work together, and they typically one form of activity will not affect only one of the principles, but several. As I said, we developed assessment tools. There is the institutional self-assessment survey, which is completed by administrators, faculty, and staff at an institution. There is the adult learner inventory, which is an adult survey, and Both of these instruments were revised in 2006, and both are integral to the ALC process. The ISAS, the Institutional Self-Assessment Survey, is completed by a team of 8 to 12 faculty, staff, and administrators from the institution. Some institutions have reported to us that the conversation that that team has in answering the questions is one of the most important aspects of the entire ALC administration. And then there is a report. I know you can't see this too well here, but you will have access to the PowerPoint so you can look at it a little bit better. When you complete the ALC toolkit, you receive a basic report. In the basic report, there is a narrative. There are also some charts which indicate your scores on the institutional self-assessment report, the perception that your team has of how your institution is addressing the 9 principles. And there's a questionnaire of about 50 questions that is answered by this team. One survey is submitted. And then you are given your raw score on those principles. You're given the best score, the average score, and how your institution ranks among all the institutions that have completed this questionnaire. Same thing happens with the students. The basic idea behind the Knoll-Levis test, the Adult Learner Inventory, is that students can rank how important one of these activities is to them, and they can also rank how satisfied they are with that activity at their institution. The smaller the gap between importance and satisfaction, the better the institution is performing. The larger the gap, the worse the institution is performing. And then for that, you also receive the raw score, the best score, the average score, and the rank of your institution and how your students perceive it. And then you also receive a comparison of the institutional perceptions and the student perceptions. And I believe that is the most important thing that you get. And I'm going to show you some of these examples. Some are on our website. Some are, well, these will also be in the slides. Here's an institution. This is an actual report. Along the left side of the page are the 9 principles. And then in this column, there is the rank order. This institution had a rank order among 42 schools that ranged from 8, which is pretty good. It received a rank. This is a perception, which we assume is the reality. The perception of its faculty, staff, and administrators is that it ranked 8 out of 42 in transitions, how it's helped students move from one area to another. And it ranked 37th out of 42, which is not so wonderful, in support. Okay? And this is the way the faculty, staff, and administrators saw the institution. Then, as I mentioned, with the Adult Learner Inventory, we look at the gap. And here is a summary of how the students viewed the institution. Same institution, and this is a real live case. The students' highest ranking for the institution was 15 out of 42. So the students in general were a lot less positive than the faculty, staff, and administrators, which in my experience is unusual. Typically the faculty, staff, and administrators are much harder on themselves than the students are. But the students did not see them as low in rankings as the faculty, staff, and administrators. In this case, 36 was the lowest score, and that was for support. So you also will get a graph showing you the comparisons. And then I broke this out. Remember I said that for me the most important thing is the comparison. So one of the things I did looking at this institution was to rank how the scores appeared on the Institutional Self-Assessment Survey and on the Adult Learner Inventory. Is it possible to see this in the back? Oh, okay, good. Number one, for the institutional self-assessment survey was transitions, remember, and surprisingly, number one for the students was life and career planning. The lowest for both groups, as you see, is support, so they agree on that. You'll notice that there are 9 scales for the faculty, staff, and administrators. There are only 8 for the students, and that's because Noel Levis and Cale agreed that the students really can't judge strategic partnerships. They don't know what kinds of partnerships the administration has made with the local government agency, for example, having the mayor do something. They don't know what kinds of partnerships have been made with other institutions. They don't know what kinds of partnerships have been made with local employers. So there are only 8 scales for the students, but 9 for the faculty, staff, and administrators. Once you get this, what do you do with it? I mean, what's the point? Well, one thing you can do when you use the data, and if you have done this, if you've already administered ALC and you've used it in some way, please let us know. But if I were looking at this real institution example, I would say that if we look at the strengths, and by looking at the strengths, we can look at how some of the comparisons look. If we look at number 3, both the students, the faculty, and looked at assessments positively. So we can certainly say that this institution evaluates appropriately from both perspectives, that it awards credit for prior learning appropriately, and that it awards credit with rigor. That is a positive, and it can be used in talking about the strengths of this particular institution. We also see that the teaching learning process is number 4 in both cases. That means, remember I talked about Suffolk County Community College, the way that the material is presented is appropriate for adult learners. The adults don't feel as though they're back in kindergarten, but they feel that they're treated with respect. And so that's something else that can be marketed and talked about as a strength. And finally, the institution itself sees partnerships as one of its strengths. And that's certainly something to leverage and to build on, to engage the community both for support in sending students and also perhaps financial support and integration with the community and helping with a lot of the other aspects of serving adult students. Another way to use the data is to look at the challenges. Those challenges are outreach, technology, and support. If we look at outreach, scored number 6, tied with number 7 on both the institutional self-assessment survey and the adult learner inventory. And don't forget, the students ranked outreach, tied with this, next to last, pretty low. And these were students already at the institution. These were students for whom outreach had been important and successful. So and what about all the students who weren't there yet? Clearly outreach is some area that this institution can work on, and students and faculty agree. The other is technology. They also agree that the approach to technology can be improved, and certainly support. And finally, what needs review or discussion? We recommend that if there are discrepancies, the institution have focus groups to find out why is finance different. Students rank finance pretty high in this group. faculty, staff, and administrators ranked it pretty low. There was one institution that I worked with that had exactly the opposite situation. Faculty, staff, and administrators ranked finance really high. Students ranked it really low. So they had a focus group to say what's going on, how come there is this discrepancy. We do have wonderful financial aid opportunities. We have local financial aid opportunities as well as state and national opportunities. We tell you all this. When we send you your admissions packet, we have a whole stack that tells you about the various financial aid opportunities. And the student said, maybe, but we don't know. We're just coming back to school. We're overwhelmed. We're frightened. We get our admissions packet. We don't have time to read everything. We're just really stressed out anyway, and seeing all this other stuff stresses us out more. We don't read it. So the faculty, staff, and administrators said, well, maybe so, but we have all this information reproduced in a lot of offices, and it's on counters. And when you come into the registrar's office, for example, just pick up the packet. And they said, when we come into those offices, we're too busy. We just run in, do what we're supposed to do, and we run out again. We don't have time to browse on the counters and see things. So what this institution did was institute a required orientation session for its returning adult students. And, they talked a lot about flexibility and how adults need the flexibility, and they have lots of stresses, they don't have time, but they finally decided that the time for the required orientation session would save a lot of time and a lot of stress in the future. And so they required of their returning adult students. And that was a result of that focus group. Yes, we need.
The students don't have access to knowing about partnerships, but at least some of us, especially those who are instructors and professors, not staff or administrators, that the information about finance has always been sort of kept from us, or we keep ourselves away from it. We don't, even if we're an academic advisor, we don't want to know about financial aid. That's not our business, and it hasn't been. But just a quick anecdote is, because of everything that's been happening in the last, 3 years, we've actually made some programmatic decisions in our graduate school about a change in the way that students can go through, because we saw a marked increase of graduate students using financial aid, and the way that we had designed our program was not going to work for them. And so we've had to delve into it, and that is something that I think, as an academic, I don't want to deal with that. That's not my job. But with adult learners, I think it becomes your job.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. And what you're saying is that people from a whole variety of areas in the institution who work with adults need to focus on a lot of these areas, if not every one of these areas. And that's why institutions have said that this team that reviews the institutional self-assessment survey is so important, because people who've never talked to each other before about adult learners get together and talk and learn from one another. So thank you. Are there any other ways that your institution, if you've already done the ALC, has used these kinds of data that you'd like to share? How many of you have used ALC before? Yeah, and I know Jean was here. She left, but she's also used it. So some of you have, and some of you are new to this. Let me tell you something else that you get in this basic report, besides the text and besides these charts. I could not duplicate it for you, because even if I were to give you the sheet, there's a lot of data on it, but there is a maximum contribution spreadsheet. What we have is every single question on the institutional self-assessment survey is sent to you with a chart. Along the left-hand side are all the questions. The right-hand side has 9 columns, one for each of the principles. And for every question, there is either a 0, which means this principle is not addressed by this question, or there is a maximum score. Many of the principles have several scores in them for each question, because remember, the principles are integrated and they work together, and not every one is separate. That one question will apply to several principles. And we send you both the maximum score possible and your institution's score, so that you see how you've scored in relation to what the best possible score would be. More than that, you can know exactly what activity you have done really well in and what activity you have not done well in, because there are 50 of them altogether, and how do they apply to the principles and your final score. I find that really, really helpful. Another thing that you get is a crosswalk. Crosswalk is a way of looking at how every question in the institutional survey relates to every question in the adult learner inventory. What have you said you do, what do students say you do, and how do those balance? You also get the reverse. How does every question in the adult learner inventory relate to the questions in the institutional self-assessment survey? So my feeling is, if you had somebody at your institution, and I know this is a fantasy, but if you had somebody at your institution who had a full-time job of looking at all of these data, and from that data, planning strategic priorities, identifying marketing campaign focuses, looking at your strengths, looking at your challenges, conducting focus groups, you would have lots of helpful information to help you succeed with adult learners. Yes, Bruce.
Judy, can you comment on, let me use the term residual value for an institution going through the ALC process, collecting the data, and its applicability to the traditional student population? And I'll tee it up a little bit more. From some of the reports that I've reviewed, this is really valuable stuff, not only for adults who are 25 and older and coming back, but it's valuable to look at the perceptions of students about your campus services, connections, more broadly, even for those who are kind of traditional students or those who commute to the campus. Can you comment on how some institutions might have used this data and information?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Thanks for that question. The surveys were normed and were first developed and normed only with adult learners, so that both the Noel Levitt Adult Learner Inventory and our institutional self-assessment survey are geared toward adult learners. Some institutions have used these surveys only with the adults who are in that part of the institution focused on adults, either continuing education unit or general studies program, or the unit that focuses on adults. Others have looked at adults across the institution. So in, that way it can be broadened. The other way in which it can be broadened is to identify those activities on the maximum contribution sheet that I talked about that can be applied to everybody in the institution, so that some of these, Bruce, some of these principles may apply to everybody, like support, but the specific activities might be different. Some of them might be the same. So what your institution might do is look at your scores in that maximum contribution spreadsheet and your own contribution spreadsheet and say, what is it that we have scored well in that we can expand across the campus? What is it that would be appropriate to everybody? What is it that we have not done well that we can work at across the campus, but that also would apply to everybody? And when you look at these questions, you'll see that some of them are generally applicable. Some of them apply only to adult learners. Yes?
Yeah, I thought that a number of your questions related to how well students or the campus thought of particular functions, okay, but do you have any impact data as well? In the sense that I might think you're doing very well with something, but I may not care about it particularly.
Oh, yes, that is the student data that, that looks at the importance and then also looks at the satisfaction. So that if I think something is not important, but I'm very satisfied, who cares? Really, you know? So yes, so the student data does look at exactly what you're talking about. But I also want to talk about something that was pointed out in our very early study. We have a book called Principles in Practice that is out of print, but you can download it from the website. And I really like this book, so I recommend it. But it talks about what 6 institutions are doing with students. And at one institution, students had exactly this response. They were not satisfied with the way communication was taught because they thought it's not important. I mean, who cares whether you speak or write effectively? Faculty, on the other hand, thought it really is important. So what they did was have a campaign to teach students the importance of effective communication rather than saying, oh, well, it's not important, the students don't care about it, let's delete it from the curriculum. So faculty still has some control about what's going on at the institution, even if they're not putting into practice exactly what the results of this are. How have some institutions specifically used the data? One of the things we did was at the end of our 2007, the end of 2007 when we finished the 2004-2007 project that was funded by Lumina, we had focus groups with several institutions and also questionnaires from several institutions to say, what have you done? How has this made a difference? What's going on? And so what we found is that institutions use the data to prepare for an accreditation review. These are data that are important, and they talk about how an institution is performing. So in a preparation for the accreditation review, there are data. It's a clear representation of strengths and challenges, and there are comparisons to other institutions and the rankings that are obtained by other institutions. Now, remember, these are perceptions. There is not an absolute standard against which the institution is judged, but they're perceptions. And that is important. I mean, you might have the absolute best program in the universe if you judge by other kinds of standards. For example, if you are judging by how many of your graduates are admitted to graduate school or how many of your graduates get jobs. But if students are not satisfied, you won't be able to attract students. If your faculty, staff, and administrators feel you're doing a terrible job, morale is not so wonderful. So you need to look at the perceptions. And the comparisons to other institutions we find are very helpful. Obviously, if you have X number of institutions, you're going to have some of the people who complete the ALC score very high and some who score very low. But that helps them evaluate their own program. This is also a valuable tool for internal program review. It identifies the essential principles for serving adult learners. How many times do you have to talk to people at your institution and say, it is important that we do X because that's an essential, related to an essential principle. Or to look at all of those questions that are identified in the contribution report to see which questions relate to which principles and what your institution might do to improve something that you are currently doing perhaps not so well. If your institutions are like many institutions that I've worked with, very often you have to explain what you're doing to internal constituents as well as outside external constituents. Outreach can be both within your own institution as well as to the outside world. So this will help explain your priorities to internal constituents, why you're doing what you're doing, and that whether this has been shown to help attract and retain adult learners. It also helps relate your priorities to the institutional. How does what you're doing relate to what your institution as a whole is doing? Again, it's a clear representation of strengths and challenges, and it forms a baseline for future reports. We do recommend that institutions administer the ALC surveys every 3 years so they can see whether there's been any change, so they can see if something has happened. And you need to have a baseline. So your ALC data do form a baseline. Many institutions have used the ALC data for strategic plans. And there are some white papers on our website that talk about how institutions have used ALC. One of the institutions, for example, Widener University, and another, Brandon University, have for many years used the ALC data and then repetitions of the ALC data for short and long-term plans. You identify what your challenges are, what can you accomplish in the short term, what is a 2 to 3 year plan, and what will your longer term plan be. At both of those institutions, faculty, staff, and administrators are required to report to the dean what their strategic plans are based on the ALC data. With the ALC data, particularly because you know exactly which activities are related to which principles, you can outline specific steps and then what is a reasonable timeline at your institution. And again, it identifies strengths, which can be given a lower priority in terms of changing the institution and putting it on a different road to help adult learners. With regard to strategic planning, this is an important tool. It also is a terrific tool for budget requests to align the resources of your institution or your unit with the needs of adult learners. What is it you need money for? And here are the data to make that request. You can talk about your ranking with regard to other institutions. You can talk about your performance gap in the students' perceptions. You can talk about specific things that you need to do and how much it will cost at your institution to do it and why you need to do it, particularly if you have goals about numbers of students you would like to serve. And it also helps then measure the changes. You can document what's happened, what's the return on the investment, what has happened because you have received budgetary resources. You also can create recruitment messages. Remember we talked about the teaching learning process in Suffolk County Community College. At this institution that I showed you, there was the strength that was assessment. It can focus on the strengths. You can compare yourself with other institutions. Remember that this institution, the example that I showed you, had a ranking of 8 for transitions among the faculty. The faculty thought transitions was really an area that was doing well. As I remember, transitions was also in the upper half for students. It didn't rank as high as it did for faculty, but not as low as outreach, technology, and support either. So it seems to me that this institution could talk about its ranking in the upper half or upper third or whatever it was for transitions and what that means to students. And it certainly, I think, means a lot to adult students who may be thrown into a totally unfamiliar situation. They're not clear how what they've done before is going to apply. The future may be very fuzzy, so this might be an amazing selling point for this institution. And then you become, when you take the ALC assessment, you become a member of the ALC Coalition. The ALC Coalition is a loose group of institutions who have done ALC. They have an opportunity to meet at the CALE conference. They can talk to one another through LinkedIn that CALE has set up. And they also know who they are. They're listed on the CALE website. So people browsing the CALE website know who these institutions who are adult learner focused are. And then we also send the institutions our logo, which they can use in their literature. And this logo indicates that you are an adult learner focused institution and the dates that this is valid for, which is a period of time that is 3 years from the administration of the first ALC. But it also helps an institution attract adult learners. If not, they not only have the data to show it, but they have a logo to show that they are adult learner focused institutions. And here are some other ways that institutions have already used the ALC data. As I mentioned, they continue the existence of the team. Because the conversation, typically the team of 8 to 12 people is comprised of people who work with adult learners as parts of their jobs, a dean perhaps, an advisor, perhaps there's an admissions person focused on adult learners, but other people at the institution who do not typically have a stamp that says adult learners are your focus, like the financial aids people, the bursar, the registrar, the marketing person, Veterans Affairs, academic people from various departments, the librarian. The institution chooses whom it would like, but very often this is a team that has learned from one another and they want to continue that learning. Or the institution can expand an adult learner committee. CALE worked with one institution. Following that, the recommendation was that the president of the institution appoint an adult learner committee. The ISAF team indicated whom they wanted on that committee, which offices they wanted represented. The president agreed to that. The president appointed this adult learner committee, and he gave the committee its charge, which not only made its goal pretty clear, but it also elevated this committee in the institution because the president had appointed these people and given them their charge. That committee is about 3 years old. It's still going strong, and it's helping the institution set the tone for adult learning throughout the institution. Then disseminating the results. Very often, the adult learning program is wonderful. Nobody knows about it at the institution. At one college that we worked with, this is a college, remember I told you CALE started in the mid-1970s. One college was one of our premier members and had a prior learning assessment policy in place, has had one since 1975. A couple of years ago, we had a focus group at the institution. The focus group was comprised of a lot of faculty members, and we said, you know, what are you doing with your prior learning assessment program? How are you evaluating students? And to a person, everybody in that focus group said, huh? What are you talking about? I never heard about prior learning. What is it? If you talk about the results of ALC, you have data. The rest of your institution knows what your unit is doing, and it helps raise the profile and also the sensitivity of the institution to adult learners. There are also topics that can be addressed at faculty, staff, and student meetings, and also topics that are relevant to everybody. And finally, there is engagement by all stakeholders. It's not as though you are asking only the faculty what they think, or only the students what they think. Everybody is participating in this enterprise. In a consortium, very often the individual institutions complete the ALC surveys, and then they share what their best practices are. Not every institution is going to be the best in everything. There are some institutions that are going to be better at some of the activities and perform better on some of the principles than others. In Arkansas, that's what happened. The Arkansas institutions that are part of career pathways all participated in the ALC survey, and then we identified institutions that did better in some areas than others and recommended that they share their best practices so that institutions in a consortium don't have to reinvent the wheel individually, but they can coordinate their activities and share their ideas. Do you have any other ideas for using the data? Well, anybody who's done something with the data, instead of putting it on the shelf, which is very tempting to do, I do have to say, with so many other things going on. Okay, let me show you what some, oh, sorry. Yeah.
I had one. We have shared our data with our Vice President of Academic Affairs, and we just had our Leadership Institute at the end of the year, and he incorporated it into the data set, the review that institutional research was using. And, it wasn't just boom, 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 our report. It was just incorporated into everything else, but we thought it was pretty effective. And I had some earlier questions to you about where do we go now, and you've really done a nice job answering those.
Thank you. Thank you. But also, Bruce, that's another way to answer your question, to integrate it with other institutional research and have it part of the whole picture of your university. And I think by that you not only integrate the data, but you integrate adult students and what you're doing for adult students into the whole institution. The most important thing is that you focus attention on adult learners' needs and issues. And here are some specific examples that might help. What I just talked about were sort of general ways of doing things. But you might want to look at some of these specific examples. This is not news to people who deal with adult students, but new and expanded course delivery options. And some of the things that people have done are Saturday, Sunday, Friday night, accelerated and hybrid. The only thing I would caution you about, do some needs assessments first. In Illinois, there is the Illinois Council for Accelerated Adult Programs. And fairly recently, there was an email blast sent to everybody from one institution saying, help, we have instituted weekend programs and nobody's coming. What are we going to do? And there were other people who wrote back saying, well, in our region, weekend programs are successful. I mean, clearly one of these institutions had done some needs assessment before launching the program, the other hadn't. So it might sound like a good idea, but I would proceed cautiously. Other institutions have redesigned the website for adult learners. Let me tell you about another institution. There's one institution which is sort of the premier adult learning institution in its state. It's part of a state university system. I tried to find adult learners on that website. I couldn't. I was directed immediately to admissions, and then I was directed to dormitories and adults as parents coming back to check out the dormitories for their students. I then tried prior learning. I couldn't find it. Eventually, it was under PLA. There's no adult student who knows that. That institution does great things for adult learners, but its website needed a lot of changes. So check out your website, see if it's accessible. This is part of outreach. In fact, Oklahoma, the Oklahoma State Board of or the State Board for Higher Education in Oklahoma specifically says outreach via technology is important and is one of the ways in which you need to reach out carefully to adult learners. But this resource for adult learners also is used as a resource for faculty and staff, and that might help address the problem of faculty and staff not knowing a lot about other areas like financial aid. This is what I told you about, redesigned and required orientation sessions for adults, a non-credit program to help adults transition to college, kind of like College 101 for adults. And at your institution, you would need to decide. There are some institutions that have this as a credit program. And adults are taught about transitioning to college. They also learn about prior learning assessment and how to prepare a portfolio. But your institution, remember we talked about aligning what you're doing with your institutional mission and vision. And so this might be something you'd want to look at, whether it's credit or non-credit, but it will help adults transition to college, succeed, and stay there, taking more courses. A program that is cost-effective, and I think there are lots of people who would want to do this, is a student mentor program to help new students. There are many institutions that have student lounges for adult students, for example, where students can congregate. The thing is, not many students might have that kind of time. So having assigned mentors might be another way of dealing with helping students to feel comfortable and providing support. Remember this example of an institution had support systems listed really low down on its list. Then one institution has hired staff focused on adults. Rather than assigning this task to everybody in the advising or admissions office, they've hired people who are directed specifically to deal with adults. There is also mandatory training for faculty at some institutions. I was at, last Tuesday, I was at a 2-year technical college and conducting a focus group for faculty. And what the faculty in that group said was that we really don't know what our special responsibilities are with adult students. It would be great to have some kind of help in knowing how we were supposed to address these students. So faculty very often want that professional development opportunity. The Adult Learner Committee, we talked about articulation agreements with other institutions. Sometimes these are state mandated, sometimes they're not. I don't know what the situation is in Georgia, but this also helps with transition. If students know what will apply to another degree. What about their prior learning assessment credit? Will this transfer to another institution? Can your institution accept credits from other institutions? I mean, what are the articulation agreements that work both ways, the students coming to you and the students going from your institution? And then again, as I mentioned, institutions have used the data to inform strategic planning and review. Another thing that institutions have done is convene student focus groups. This is a way of showing the students that you value what they are saying. It also helps clarify what it is that they would like that you are not doing, and it helps clarify what you are doing well. At the same institution that I was at on Tuesday, I spoke with students, and they went on and on and on and on and on about things that they were frustrated with. And finally, I said at the end of the time, is there one thing you would like to tell me, one thing you want to leave me with? And to a person, they all said, this is a blessing. This is the most wonderful opportunity I've had. And that's nice to hear, and you want students to be able to say that. So student focus groups are also a help. And finally, including the data in your annual report to bolster what you're doing and to justify all the commitment and time and effort and good that you are doing for adult learners. somebody from Northwestern State University in Louisiana, Dr. Darlene Williams, who's the Vice President for Technology Research and Economic Development, spoke about ALC, and she had nice things to say about it, to identify where the university might work better with adults and also to help them with marketing. And if you'd like more information about ALC, you can just go to our website, as I said earlier, easy to remember, www.kale.org. And for those of you who want more information about ALC, just get in touch with me. I'll be happy to help you. And if you and that means people who are just starting, or people who have already started who want to say, what do we do now? Help. I'll be glad to help you in any way I can. Are there any questions now that you have? Well, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.